There. Kind of hard to believe it's in a kid's book, but it's called Drunkard's Song.
Military Madness event, Saturday, June 12th, Minneapolis, Minnesota.
I'll try to lean in as much as I can, but I just want to thank everybody for having me here today. I'm a very huge fan of WAMM, Women Against Military Madness, and an admirer of their organization because it's one of the very few organizations based here in the Twin Cities that really gets to the heart, the root cause of conflicts that we see around the world. WAMM gets to the root of the issue, and they're not afraid to expose the military-industrial complex, which is a really big root cause of a lot of the issues that we see here today, including Islamophobia. So I'm excited to be here today to talk about Islamophobia and the selling of hate, this new industry that's literally worth millions of dollars to create this enemy, which are Muslims, to justify military actions abroad. I know, just like Women Against Military Madness. Sure. We're doing a mic check again. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, because we
Yeah.
can make an adjustment.
It's good.
Oh, it's good. It's good.
Is he comfortable leaning forward?
I'm not as comfortable as I'd like to be, but I can
Could she lift it up? No, I got it here. Oh, you know what? Yeah. Where is this? Where's the? We got it.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's fine. We can hear you back here.
Even though
And we're half deaf, and we can hear you. You're doing well.
Yeah, it's more, they just started. Of course,
How many WAMM people does it take to?
Here's thank you to Don Olson, who of course is once again taping. Don Olson from KFAI.
All right, round two. Can you guys hear me now? All right. If you guys don't mind, just because we haven't recorded, I'm going to kind of start over a little bit. So I just want to thank Women Against Military Madness for inviting me today, because WAMM is an organization that I greatly admire, because I can't think of any other organizations. Of course, there are a handful of them, but WAMM really gets to the heart and to the root of the conflicts around the world, and really challenges the status quo that we often don't see, even from the liberal establishment, the so-called progressive community. And so, I know, we always use these marks when we say the progressive community. So I want to thank WAMM for inviting me and for being at the forefront of this movement. And of course, the women that run the organization are amazing, they are courageous, and like I always like to say, a woman's place is in the revolution. It's very difficult to challenge war narratives, and I know this firsthand. As Margaret introduced me at the very beginning, I did grow up I was born and raised here in Minneapolis. I actually grew up just down the street from here, so when I was driving here, it kind of brought back childhood memories. But when I was at the age of about 9 years old, my parents moved us overseas to Jerusalem, to Palestine. And as an American Muslim, an American Arab, I witnessed firsthand what war can do to communities, to people. I witnessed human rights abuses committed against humanity. I lived under Israeli occupation. I lived under Israeli apartheid. And of course, when we moved back to the United States in 2001, it was the same year that September 11th happened, but we had moved back just a couple of months before the tragic day of September 11th. And so I was a young teenager, about 12, preteen you could say, 12 years old, and I had suffered from PTSD, what service members suffer from when they return from war. Even though I myself didn't live under that violence, I witnessed so much violence. I witnessed children trying to cross through checkpoints on their way to school. I witnessed kids getting shot with rubber bullets. We used to sit on our rooftop at our apartment in Jerusalem and watch the planes go over us, getting ready to shoot down homes in Ramallah. And I was, of course, 11 years old. I always look back and I'm like, how did my parents let me do that? But that was the reality of life over there. That was so normal. Occupation and violence and just what we saw, I mean, that was the day-to-day life there, and nobody ever thought twice about it. It was the reality of how Palestinians lived. And so when I had moved back to the United States, I was absolutely traumatized. And all I could think of as an 11 and 12-year-old was the war that I had left behind. And of course, I had moved back to Maple Grove, Minnesota, to suburbia in America, and I had gone to Osteo Junior High, and nobody in my class had ever heard of Palestine. I would say, yeah, I just came back from Palestine, and say, oh, Pakistan. You know, they just had no idea where Palestine was on the map. And if they did know what Palestine was, their image and this caricature that they had of what Palestinians were was that of barbarians, terrorists, Hamas, or Hamas, as Israel likes to call them. They would imagine dark, armed men with their faces covered, you know, yelling Allahu Akbar with guns, and, you know, children with, you know, wrapped in Hamas clothing and uniform, you know, threatening to kill, you know, Israel. Those were the images that we were bombarded with in the U.S. media. And of course, the media never presented the conflict in a way that showed people like me and my family and the people that lived under Israel Israeli occupation, the Palestinians. And so shortly after, within a couple of months, the tragic day of September 11th happened. And I sat there as a 12-year-old and witnessed, mature enough, I guess, to see the media beat the drums of war to justify conflict in the Middle East. After 9/11, the media and our politicians stoked our fears and anxiety and threatened that if we don't go overseas, if we don't go and bomb these countries, if we don't go and attack Afghanistan, the terrorists are going to come at our footsteps. They're going to come here on our land and attack us first. And so a war was justified and a war was waged. And from there, at the age of 12, I turned to the media as the problem. I turned to the media to keep up to date with what was going on. And because of my experiences in Palestine and because of this new stoked anxiety and fear and trumped up fear that was being spewed by our politicians to justify these military actions, I felt a connection with the media. Obviously, I was very upset with the media, but I thought, this entity, the media, is exactly why Americans, my fellow Americans, don't understand conflict overseas. They are being bombarded daily, constantly, with propaganda. Let's be honest here.
Yes.
The media is currently controlled by 6 corporations. 6 corporations control over 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. And so I saw this as a very big problem in the way that people learned about what was going on in the world around them. Those 6 corporations, of course, are GE, Viacom, Disney, News Corp, CBS, and Time Warner. So I understand when groups like WAMM are at the forefront trying to educate people, give them an alternative perspective, just how difficult that can be. Sometimes it feels like you're speaking to a wall because people are so bombarded and inundated with this information coming from the corporate media, from their newspapers, local news, the BuzzFeeds, the Huffington Post, the CNNs, the Fox Newses, whatever it may be. And then we're at the forefront, like, WAMM or myself, and we're speaking up against, or trying to expose the realities and the true costs of these wars, and people just really have no idea. Or as Democracy Now's Amy Goodman said it best, we don't have a mainstream media anymore. We have a corporate media beating the drums of war. Now, we have an economy that is fueled by war, by bloodshed, by violence and genocide and exploitation. The United States is now involved in over 134 acts of war in predominantly Muslim nations across Africa and the Middle East, with over 1,000 military bases dotting the globe. And now NATO and US military bases are also encircling China and Russia. And of course, the media is a distraction. It distracts us with all of the sensationalism that it covers, and it doesn't even acknowledge these wars, these acts of wars, these violence, this military-industrial complex, this war-fueled economy. It describes it as defensive, and so do our politicians. So how does a nation justify empire building abroad? Immediately following the 9/11 attacks, Americans, as I mentioned, were riddled with fear, with panic and anxiety. Talking heads and even our elected leaders stoked our fears, warning that there would be more attacks to come unless we stopped the terrorists in their tracks. And if any of you remember, which I'm sure you all do, all the narratives that were being spewed to us, we were asked, who flew the planes into the Twin Towers? Of course, the Bush administration and other pro-war neocons working behind the scenes in Washington tossed out some answers. And first, of course, was Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, but eventually the media painted the picture, this caricature, that it was the Muslims. Those 6 hijackers had now represented over 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. And with this, Bush and his administration launched the invasion of Afghanistan and announced the global war on terror, which continues today with no end in sight and no real victories to speak of. But then in 2003, the target shifted. And now it was Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, who we in the United States had won once cherished and even installed and armed with chemical weapons had weapons of mass destruction. Our intelligence was definite, they said, and with that, the U.S. invaded Iraq. And of course, I would say up to today, over 2 million Iraqis have died as a result of 9/11. And we're not talking about jihadists. We're talking about innocent civilians, most of which were children and women. And this, of course, doesn't account for the over 500,000 children, just children, that died due to our sanctions on Iraq before the war in Iraq. Of course, the WMDs were never found because they never existed. And not only was the intel faulty, but it turned out to be a red herring, obscuring a war for oil and resources. A country was invaded, its people killed, injured, and displaced. So the U.S. could install someone more friendly to U.S. interests. Meanwhile, the upheaval in these and countries hit by the war on terror created a power vacuum that's being exploited today by terror groups like Daesh or ISIS and the countries that arm and fund them. But of course, none of what unfolded was unforeseeable. I recently interviewed Robbie Martin, who is the filmmaker behind A Very Heavy Agenda. His documentary film series examines how neoconservatives like the Kagans, like the Crystals, like the Cheneys, seized on 9/11 as a catalyst for establishing a new world order. And I know when we hear new world order, we sound like those crazy tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists, but it's actually a real concept. Or as Karl Rove said, a senior policy advisor to President Bush, we are an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We are history's actors. And you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. And that reality has certainly been molded for us. With 9/11 fading from our memory, yet it's made a huge impact on our lives and the current power structure that we have today. Robbie Martin, the filmmaker behind that film, had exposed that, and by the way, his film documents, it's not an analysis, it actually documents the sayings and the actions of these individuals. But he warns that the U.S. needed a new enemy, so it chose an old one. But it's not Muslims and Islam. It was actually Russia. Islam and Muslims were used as a smokescreen, I guess you could say, to distract from the real impetus of this war. Now, I'm not here to talk about politics too much when it comes to these wars, because I know that we are all very well educated about these conflicts. But I wanted to frame the situation since 9/11 as to why we are here today and why Islamophobia is an issue today. And I could get into, world, the U.S. and Russia and all these countries careening towards World War III and what's happening in Syria and Libya and Ukraine, but I'll leave that for another time. It's its own topic and its own beast. But what had happened after, but with what Robbie Martin warns, that that the media has basically chosen to portray Muslims and Islam as the enemy, when in reality, it's actually Russia. It's easier for Americans and people to be afraid of Muslims because it's ingrained in our history to really not get along with Muslims because of the civilization of jihad narrative that's being spewed every single day. Today in our media, we have images of masked men in orange jumpsuits yelling Allahu Akbar, cinematic beheading videos. Sometimes we wonder how they have more cell phone service than we do maybe in this building. Militants cutting off hands, raping women, pillaging villages, destroying historical artifacts. And although I mentioned the cell phone service, what ISIS is doing is no laughing matter. Because it's a real problem that's ravaging the Middle East. And of course, we mostly hear about it when Kurds are abducted or, Christian Egyptians are abducted by ISIS. But in reality, and of course that's a tragedy in itself, but in reality, ISIS has targeted Muslims. They are killing, ransacking, raping, kidnapping, pillaging, you name it, Muslims and Muslim villages. Not just Sunnis, but Shias as well. They're targeting all Muslims. That, you know, whoever doesn't agree with their ideology, they will target you. And so the biased media coverage has played up this fear and hostility to justify the military actions abroad as a fight against a threatening religion. But this manufactured anxiety was, of course, as I mentioned before, merely a distraction from the true impetus for this conflict, which is for control over resources in the Middle East and North Africa as part of a corporate empire-building strategy where a handful of corporations monopolize the world's resources. And that's why TPP
Yes.
is so important to be followed in the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. Muslims have now been positioned as the boogeyman of our time because of this true impetus for war and conflict. And as an industry, as I started this conversation, Islamophobia is literally an industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, the politicians like Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, Pamela Geller, Michelle Bachmann, John McCain, and even President Obama, who decided to visit a Muslim American mosque for the first time during the last year of his presidency. These are the actors that the military-industrial complex, that prop from the military-industrial complex, that have jumped on the bandwagon of Islamophobia to grab their share of the pie. And even our would-be leaders fan the flames of Islamophobia to court voters. And of course, we always think of Donald Trump first because he's just been this, egotistical maniac, that's just, fascist maniac that's, grabbing so many headlines and has become clickbait for so many news agencies, to grab his sound bites because they're so outrageous. But what Donald Trump did is, as the media likes to treat him as this, random kind of, hate-filled speech person, he's actually helped expose the true feelings the United States has towards Muslims and Islam. I mean, let's be honest here. We might have men or women in their nice suits in Washington that might say we should protect our Muslim Americans and not let them feel ostracized. But in reality, they're fueling the conflict in the Middle East. They're bombing the kids in the Middle East. They are arming rebels in countries like Syria and Libya to ravage those nations. And of course, the victims of those wars are Muslims, the majority are Muslims. Now, Donald Trump in particular has built a campaign around constitution-flouting promises to protect Christianity and monitor mosques throughout the country, and even close the borders to Muslims around the world. And we have people like Ted Cruz, with ISIS taking over the headlines. He says he wants to make the sand glow in the Middle East by carpet bombing the region to get rid of the disease, the cancer, which is ISIS. And indeed, ISIS is a disease, and it is a cancer. But it's one that, let's be honest here, our policies help create. And last year in particular, we saw a marked increase in anti-Muslim bigotry and hate crimes in the wake of the ISIS attacks in Paris and the San Bernardino shootings. Women and girls were attacked who were wearing hijab. Mosques were firebombed and threatened with bombs. And protests were held by armed militiamen outside of mosques in Arizona and elsewhere, aimed at impeding Muslim Americans' constitutional right to freely worship. All in all, 2015 was the worst year for anti-Muslim bigotry and hate crimes since 9/11. And I actually posted something about this on my Facebook. You guys don't even follow me, but I post a lot about these happenings on Facebook. And when these armed protesters were encircling these mosques to stop Muslim Americans from practicing their religion, they had said that we blame these people for ISIS. And I just couldn't help but just laugh. These constitutionalists, if they really, really, really knew American politics, they would be protesting on Capitol Hill, telling our politicians to stop the arms flow to all of these rebel groups in the Middle East, to stop the arms flow to countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, who are openly now funding and arming ISIS. They don't even deny it at this point. They're buying their oil from these groups, they're arming them. And so that's where those armed protesters should really be protesting. Not at a mosque that made a very open statement that not only do they denounce ISIS, but they will report anyone who even shows any sympathy or empathy towards ISIS or terrorism. Now, Islamophobia is the cancer that has struck our society. Not necessarily, not Muslims, as you could say. But my family found itself caught in this with a story that made national headlines this summer. And I always tell people, our life with my family, apart from what happened in Palestine, becoming a journalist and starting Mpls News, we could write a book about what has happened to my family, because this past summer, my mom and dad got caught in an Islamophobia case. My parents were held at gunpoint when they were trying to pick up my brother for looking suspicious. This past summer, my parents were sitting in their car, and they were waiting to pick up my brother from a friend's house. And a white suburban mom came out. I don't know if she had been drinking, I don't think she was, but her hair was all crazy and she looked really, really scary. She comes out with a rifle pointed at my parents in their car, and she said, open the window, or pull down the window, excuse me. What are you doing in this neighborhood? And my parents, of course, were completely freaked out. They froze. My mom couldn't even, she said she was so scared. She didn't even, her phone was in her hand, she didn't even know how to type. She didn't even know how to dial 911. She was so scared. This woman forced them to get their windows down. She threatened to shoot them. She said, you better tell me what you're doing in this neighborhood or I'm going to shoot you. My mom wears the hijab like I do. And they both my parents have very thick accents. They're immigrants. They came here in the late 70s. And my dad has darker complexion. I'm really white, but my parents are actually a lot darker than I am. They look very Middle Eastern. And she eventually went to my dad's side and forced him out of the car, had the rifle pointed at him, forced him out of the car, put the rifle, pointed it from his neck down to his back, and marched him to my brother's friend's house and said, prove to me that you're here to pick up your son because I know you're kind and you look suspicious. This lady treated my parents as suspect. And that is the scenario that we see today. Eventually, just to shorten up the story, my dad, of course, was freaked out, and he's a 60-year-old man, and he had this gun pointed at him, and she marched him up to the door, and by the time they got to the door, my brother coincidentally was opening up the door to come out, because they were sitting there waiting for him, and he knew that they were outside. And the woman eventually put the rifle back and said, oh, I'm sorry, thank you for showing me that you're son. She said, please don't call the police. And of course, my parents were just absolutely freaked out. They were traumatized. I mean, they were terrorized that night. She had claimed to them as well that she was hired by the police to look out for people like my parents. She was the neighborhood watch.
Oh, yeah.
My parents called me that night and they said, they called me and my brother that night and said, this is what happened. So I said, Mom, hang up with me and call the police and tell them what happened. And they called the police, and eventually the police went and found the woman. They arrested her. They found the rifle. It turned out to be a pellet gun, but my parents had absolutely no idea. And the fact that she even threatened to shoot them is a felony. So.
Hey.
Yeah.
And so this story, of course, was picked up by KARE 11 locally and several other national news organizations because Islamophobia is real. The hate, the treating other Muslims as suspect is a real scary phenomenon that has really struck the United States. But or before I get into that phenomenon, I just want to mention too that after I had posted it on my social media channels that this had happened to my parents, I had a storm of so-called constitutionalists come and bombard me with pictures of bacon, with pictures of pigs, cute pigs. I don't know why they would do that. Cute baby pigs. They had bombarded me with cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which, by the way, is drawings of the Prophet Muhammad is not forbidden in Islam, despite what the media tells us every single day to stoke these fears. They had posted pictures of men having sexual intercourse with goats and camels. I mean, really, really outrageous, racist, Islamophobic, really hateful things. And I thought, this hate is real. Every single day we report on these atrocities abroad, and instead of the masses standing up to our government, government officials, to these policies that are fomenting these conflicts, Americans are turning against other Americans to fight each other. And that's why I always describe this as a divide and conquer tactic. Because it's so much easier if we could just hate each other and fight each other. What more could our politicians want than for us to be distracted while all of these policies are taking place abroad? Now, Islamophobia, as I mentioned, is a real problem, but I want to take some responsibility for the Islamophobia. I think Muslims in the US are partly to blame for Islamophobia. And I don't mean to put all the blame on them, but I want to criticize some of our community because just the other day I heard a fantastic speech. It was a TED Talk by Dalia Mujahid, and she's an Islamic scholar and a researcher. She's very well known. And she spoke about the trends of Islamophobia and said, when you look at me, what do you see? What are the images that come to mind? What are the stereotypes that you think of? And she had mentioned how Muslims are a huge asset in American society. They're not a cancer, they're an organ, they're a leading organ in our society. And of course, she was only given 15 minutes. I mean, you can only say so much in 15 minutes. But what was not mentioned is any criticism of U.S. policies. And I think that is a huge problem that we face within the Muslim community, is that we are so busy defending ourselves, to fit in, to show that we are the most patriotic Americans, in which, it's understandable. We're criticized, we're under the microscope right now, and, these are natural phenomena that happen. But when Muslims speak up against U.S. wars, arming and funding of rebel groups, funding and arming and alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia that produces this Wahhabi, literally created the Wahhabi narrative that fuels radicalism. What happens to us when that happens? We get called anti-American. I've been called anti-American. Muslims who speak up against war get called anti-American. We get called ISIS apologists. Why are you criticizing our U.S. government when you should be addressing your own issue, ISIS? ISIS is not our issue. This is one of the biggest problems that we face as Muslims in the United States. And this is something that I feel like we should talk about more. And I've tried to bring it up to other Muslims, but Muslim Americans, just like other Muslims, they're bombarded by these 6 corporations that control 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. They're not an exception to the rule. They're getting the same information that most Americans are getting. And a lot of times, even those communities aren't fully aware of how these situations erupt in the Middle East. And so, with this issue of Islamophobia, the media has been really successful in painting this caricature of Muslims as an other. And let me ask you guys this. When you think of the caricatures that Muslims, or that the media has created about Muslims, what do you think of? And I want honest answers, really. Okay?
somebody who's so ideological, I think of a Muslim Donald Trump. You know,
Right.
so ideological, you can't reason with them.
Right.
They're just so, you know, the anger's taken over, them, that's just, you know, or whatever.
Okay.
That was the first stereotype I had when I encountered a Palestinian, was that there was no, he was upset with something I said, and, you know, I went away from him because I didn't know that was the
Sure.
situation.
Okay. Okay.
We can't hear the people that are answering.
So we've got violent, unreasonable. We have oppressors of women.
Looks very different. And the reason I bring that up, there was this terrible Nazi film about the Jews, and they didn't focus on the assimilated Jews. They focused on the more Eastern Europeans with the beards, the hats,
Right.
and, you know, that they just simply look different.
Right. Right. As an other.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
Okay.
I
Uneducated.
don't think anything about Muslims because it had nothing to do with 9/11 and everybody knows that. Please God.
I think, you know, but I'm asking more
We
about
did
the
it.
media, the
Get to your
media
blogs,
caricatures.
Google it.
Sure.
Uneducated.
Obsessed by their religion and dominated by their moms.
Okay. There's somebody back there that
Uneducated.
uneducated,
Loud.
loud,
Dressed differently.
dressed differently. Okay.
What we don't ever hear of is that Muslims are victims,
Right.
and they are, starting in Palestine.
Right.
Some of the most victimized people on planet Earth.
I heard somebody else back there. I'm going to take a couple more before I get into my final statement.
It says devout and family oriented.
Okay, that's not too bad. That's a good one. Okay.
You can tell he's not watching TV.
John the Baptist, you know, a real person, a
Okay.
real person, or Jesus, or somebody that doesn't fit in.
Right.
That's good.
Right. An outsider. Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
Monolithic, in a way, unlike maybe the rest of our society where we admit that there are different groups, I think we just lump all Muslims into one.
Right. Absolutely. And that's exactly, I mean, all of those descriptions are exactly what the media has created about Muslims and Islam. This is the caricature, as I like to call it, that the media has painted about Muslims to describe Islam, the Middle East, you know, Muslim Americans. And so Muslims in the U.S., they don't want to fit those ideas. So they really try very, very hard to fit in and to dress American. I mean, I do. I was born and raised here, so I have no other way to dress. But, a lot of girls will reject wearing the hijab, for example, and, they'll, dressed in certain ways. I mean, I know some Muslim girls who will even go to an extreme extent where they're very sexualized in the way that they dress because they reject the way the media describes Islam. So they take the complete opposite route. And so I think that's really interesting. Just the psychology that goes behind this, because we're Muslim Americans are put on the defensive. But the concept of creating this other, creating an enemy, is not a new concept, and Muslims are not going to be the last group. And so this has been a phenomenon that has plagued societies for a very, very, very long time. And of course, we're talking about it now because it's reached really dangerous levels. And it is very dangerous. I mean, my parents, if that woman had had a gun, a real gun, they would have been shot that night. And there have been cases where innocent people have been killed. But of course, the media doesn't like to label them as Islamophobia or hate crimes. We have the case of the 3 American Muslim, I think they were early 20s, and they were in their home and they were gunned down by Bill Hicks, I think his name was. And the media had said, well, it was one parking dispute. Well, you don't go gun down 3 people over a parking dispute. And his Facebook page, of course, was filled with anti-Muslim rhetoric and constitutional rhetoric. And so this caricature that has been painted about Muslims really reminds me a lot of the caricature that you had mentioned that was painted about Jews in Europe for a very, very long time. And I actually wrote an article about the dangerous trends of Islamophobia at the hands of magazines like Charlie Hebdo. They like to tout that they're a First Amendment free speech magazine, when all they do is ridicule minorities and religious minorities. Black people are animated in a way that they're animals. Muslims are animated in a way like they're woman-hating, they're violent, they're extremists. These are the images that Charlie Hebdo magazine spews every single day. And of course, that's not reason for groups like ISIS or anyone to go bomb them or attack them. But magazines like that really fulfill one agenda, which is to serve the elite. I mean, the groups that are funding and financing magazines like Charlie Hebdo, and I'm sure many of you know who I'm talking about, right? The Charlie Hebdo magazine, are the same groups that are in French Parliament and government and the elitists there that are profiting from constant war and from the divide and conquer tactics that they foment in their country. But I had done an article when Charlie Hebdo magazine had released those cartoons about Muslims and the ISIS attack had happened in France. And I had placed an image of the Wandering Jew cartoon. Are you guys familiar with the Wandering Jew cartoon?
No.
It's a picture, it's a cartoon that was, I think it was the 13th century that it was created, I don't remember, but it was in France. So France has a very long history of bigotry and racism, not just towards Muslims and Africans, but against Jewish people as well. But the image was of Jesus Christ on the cross, and he had the crown of thorns. And a Jewish person was walking by him, and of course it was a very, like you had mentioned, it was the caricature of the Jew with the long nose, and the hair a certain way, and crouched down. And really, really disgusting imagery about Jewish people, really racist. And Jesus had said to the wandering Jew to the Jew to wander the earth, because he was so upset with what had happened with the crucifixion of Christ. And so this cartoon, just like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons and the images that we see every single day about Muslims, was spread around Europe for over 300 years. 300 years. And was used and touted and flaunted by many of those in Nazi Germany to justify the persecution of Jews. And that's what we see today. That's exactly what we're seeing today. And of course, there were political agendas behind it. I mean, it's never really about religions or Jewish people or Muslim people. There's always these political agendas that are working behind the scenes. But that's exactly what we're seeing today. It's another Holocaust in the name of money, in the name of wars, in the name of genocides. And today just so happens to be Muslims. Thank you.